Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and reenchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and reenchanting. Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. I am so delighted today to be sitting alongside an old and dear friend, Dougald Hine, who is in Sweden. And I've known Dougald from before he was in Sweden, when he was in England. And I remember meeting him at a gathering in real life out in the fields of a fair that he was organizing, a festival that you were organizing. And that gathering itself was a space of people from all sorts of walks of life coming together and talking about the end of the world as we know it and what might be arising. And I have such it kind of sparked a friendship. And he's an extraordinary person. Always feels a little bit awkward saying that when I'm like also looking at you, Dougald.
Well, it's lovely to be sitting here and having this long distance conversation. I remember that session. I remember that first time we met because you stepped right into the middle of the cauldron of a really intense, like Sunday morning of an intense festival, and you just stood up and volunteered to take notes and help us like draw out the things that were coming from all of these different voices. So that's my first memory of you,
Ah,
somebody stepping forward and putting themselves gently in the middle of
ah.
something where there was a lot of feeling and a lot of thinking and a lot of stuff that was wrestling to be said out of people's mouths. So it's good to be still talking all these years later.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I actually forgotten that part of it. It's so wonderful. Like origin stories are things we need to like carry together. We share them together. No one of us has a whole memory. And I reached out to Dougal because, or to you, I'm just going to talk about you as you. I reached out to you in part because some of my students and clients I noticed were talking a lot about their own desires to start schools and to be part of like the understanding that education needs to shift and needs to change, and the understanding that adults are in the midst of a moment where so many adults are recognizing that this, as you say, to use your language, that the story that we have been telling ourselves, our culture, our civilization, so-called civilization, has been telling ourselves, has in so many ways come to the end of its yarn. And the news stories are both trying to emerge, collapsing upon themselves, actually emerging. All sorts of things are happening, different things happening in different places. And in this, the question of how do we engage? And even more so, and I'm actually just going to jump right in and tell you this question that a friend of ours, a woman, Anna Smedeby, who both of us know, I was asking her, what should we talk, what should Dougald and I talk about? And she says that she wrote this exquisite question, which I haven't told you yet. In a world where the operating system and prevailing structures are making it fall apart, where knowledge itself and the way of knowing is contributing to disaster, what does it make sense to teach and to learn? If
Mm.
what you know is wrong and you know that it is, and you know that the tentacles of modernity are so deeply entwined with your wishes and values and feelings of right and of wrong, how can you even start to disengage? Who has the legitimacy to teach you anything? Who do you
Mm.
trust? What is there to hold on to? I thought we could just start there.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Thank you, Anna, for the easy question. No, you know, Anna's mother
Mm,
comes from this little place, Astavola, where I'm sitting speaking to you.
mm,
And I met her because they came to visit us here after we'd found this place to set up our school in this old shoe shop, 60 degrees north. And when so this is Anna Smedeby who asked the question, when her mother was a child, Uppsala, which is the nearest city to here, wasn't an hour on the bus like it is now. It took rather longer to get there. And there was no school here in Astavola that went beyond, I guess, the age of 12, something like that. And so her father, Anna's grandfather, moved with her to the city of Uppsala to spend the weeks living there. And he changed his job so that she could carry on in school and end up being a librarian
mm,
and traveling around the world, and then have a daughter who ended up in Brussels working at the European Commission. And I start there hoping that Anna doesn't mind me sharing that story of the generations of her family that they've shared with me, because I think we have to place ourselves within generations, within journeys that exceed the scope of a single lifetime. Sometimes, because like that story, they tell us how short the arc into and through and coming out the far side of this thing we talk about as modernity may be. I sit here sometimes in the evenings looking through the boxes of letters that we inherited with this house, because same family had been here for 3 generations since 1911, and we bought the place from the grandson of the shoemaker who had the house built in the first place, and he was turning 70, and we said to him, look, you can leave behind anything that you can't, that you don't have the energy to deal with. And he left us a lot of stuff, a lot of the junk and the treasures and the legacy of that. And it feels like we, in setting up the school here, moved into a history. It's a bit like grafting yourself onto an old tree. Um, you acquire an extra side to your family besides the biological ancestors by which you got here. And part of the pressure that modernity has gifted to us is a pressure to make sense of our lives on the scale of a single individual, on the scale of a single lifetime, rather than to try to be, a stitch within the weave of something longer and larger, where we never get to see the whole of the pattern. And so part of the work of stepping out from under that burden and finding some way of showing up to the times in which we find ourselves is to show up without needing to see the whole of the pattern, without needing to be as one person, as Dougald or Sara or Anna, an answer to questions so vast that when we really hear them, when we really let them land, we feel like they're going to crush us.
mm,
And so when it comes to the question of who to trust, I always say you can learn a lot from someone without necessarily trusting them. Some of the people I've learned a good deal from in my time are people I still don't entirely trust, but can appreciate very much. And then there is something else, which is that trust grows in relationship. And I think we need to be in relationship in multiple directions
Mhm.
in order to be learning together, finding our bearings, finding ways to show up wherever we find ourselves. And probably nobody listening to this is living in this small town of 1,500 people at 60 degrees north in Sweden. And therefore, for that reason and lots of other reasons, nobody's answer is going to be exactly the same as my answer. But I I think we have to, I don't we have to. I think it's um we can seek to recognize in others and then model in ourselves ways of being that don't entirely fit the shapes of modernity, that aren't entirely legible to those systems, um, and do it recognizing that those systems, on the one hand, have less life and certainty and confidence in them than they had a while ago. And on the other hand, that they still are larger and exercise more power and control and domination than the things that do seem to have life in and are growing and coming alive and giving today, and that that's part of the strangeness and discomfort of where we're operating from.
Mhm. 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 There's so many beautiful threads in what you were just in the stitches that you're helping us all sew and that we're sewing together. Um, as you were talking about, Anna has told me some of the stories about a little bit of her family, and I was thinking how appropriate it was to think about that because I remember meeting with you in Uppsala and doing a talk in Uppsala with you at the publication of a Dark Mountain book, and then subsequently the 2020 conversation that we had um, around origin stories and when your ancestors are the problem is how I met Anna to begin with.
Mm.
So it kind of feels lovely 4 years and 6 years later to kind of come back to that. And I mention this because this thing about trusting is so much about these webs of relationships. And sometimes you know the people and sometimes you don't, but like we are already interwoven. We're
Mm.
already stitched together. And then in the course of our lives, like we are already in the fabric. I was doing a ritual for doing two baby blessing rituals recently. Um, and it was just struck me so much to be incarnate, to be born is to be born into the web of all of life. Like it just happens. There is no, we can, to bless it is to bless life. Like we're in it. You almost don't need to do anything because the thing itself is so miraculous and so amazing. But as adults, we need to be brought back. We need to kind of have the recognition of how each new life or each new birth, which are ongoing, how that ongoing stream of life reorients us
Yes.
and it brings us back every time to what it means to be an animal, to what it means to cry, to what it means um, to be born and to suffer and to live. Like we get to get reorientated even as we are so-called supporting this little person orientating themselves and surviving. So and that's how our mutual survival happens. So and like also in that story I'm like reminded of, right, like parents move and do so much. They change their lives for the education of their children.
Right.
And we reorient ourselves like pretty consistently. We'll reorient ourselves for the education of our children and sometimes for ourselves as adults as well. Our learning journey takes us into new places. It's the shifting of that consciousness and the hope, the great hope that if we get the education, quote unquote, right, then we will be cared for and protected, and that our life, that we can make it in this world. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. Like really that we can survive. Like
Yes.
it's part of our survival.
As you're talking about that, I'm remembering another multi-generational story that I heard a few years ago from an artist called Paul Kira, who was born in, I guess, suburban London, but his parents came from India. And when he was 6 years old, his grandmother called his parents from the village high up in the foothills of the Himalayas and said, "It's time. You have to send him now, or it'll be too late."
Mm.
She must have been a powerful woman because her son did what he was told. And so this 6-year-old boy was sent from London to the village of I don't know, 150 people, maybe 300. And the way Paul told it to me, he said, within 2 weeks, I'd learned how to wring the neck of a chicken and pluck it, and I'd forgotten that I'd ever lived anywhere else. And then at about the age of 12, he was brought back to England and put into school. And he said, again, within about 2 weeks, I'd forgotten that I'd ever lived anywhere else. And maybe this sort of brings to mind that extraordinary plasticity of childhood where we so quickly reform into contexts. And so he said somewhere in his mid-20s, he would find these things coming out of his mouth and realize that his friends were looking at him strangely. And he thought, yeah, I used to live in the mountains. And so a lot of his work has been a kind of stitching together of this, extraordinary dramatization of something which I think many people in the world today have within their experience and their families in one way or another, of belonging in radically different places, radically different worlds. But the bit that really blew my mind in that first conversation we had was he said, so, I spend a lot of time back in the village now, and we have a traditional education system in the village. And he said, if you're part of it, then through your life, you always have somebody whose role it is to give you a question. And so you sit with that person and talk for a few hours and you come away with a question. And you'll carry that question wherever you're going, about your work in the village or away as a migrant worker or off in London as an artist and photographer or whatever. And when you have something that feels like it could be an answer, you go back to that person the next time you have the chance to do so, and you sit down together and you talk about it. And maybe between you, you decide, yeah, that's a good answer. And you're given a new question. Or maybe you decide, well, it's worth carrying that question for a little while longer and seeing what other kinds of answer might show up. And what I notice in the years since Paul gave me that story, and I've told it in various settings, is I notice a kind of longing that often surfaces when people hear that. And it's a longing which has to do with wishing that we had been born into a way of living that cared enough to offer you that kind of ongoing relationship as an education running on through your life. Because to the extent that those of us who, well, us in this conversation or those listening to it, have anything comparable, we've probably had to go somewhere towards the edges of the ways of living that we were born into in order to find people who would listen to us long enough to offer us a question that might be ours to carry, or recognize the question that we're carrying. Because that's not really what education of the kind that is valued within modernity and that has been uh, sent out with the best of intentions to overwrite the cultures of everyone everywhere in the name of development and in the name of giving people a better chance in life has looked like. And so maybe there's just something humbling in hearing a story like that one from Paul Kira that asks us to be, in Ursula Le Guin's words, realists of a larger reality, to widen the scope of what we think a word like education might mean, where we think education happens, and who gets to define it.
Yeah, it's interesting when you're telling that story. What arose, what kind of came to mind immediately was that for most, I often talk about growing up in a Quaker community,
Mm.
um, and how much I learned and how much of my gifts were recognized by my elders at a very early age, and how I was very gifted, and I was recognized as very gifted, and I was never seen, no one ever treated it as unusual or as particularly special.
Yeah.
So to be a gifted person was very average and normal and to be expected. And I am very, like, now, especially, I'm very grateful for that. It didn't mean my life would be easy or that I would find anything would be easier than anyone else. It was just, yeah, okay, these are your gifts, like, great, carry on. Um,
Mm.
but what I hadn't realized until kind of recently was that I also, I mean, I knew it, but I hadn't talked about it, was that I also grew up with a herd of horses. And I never thought to talk about it. And there's all sorts of reasons why. I think a lot of that actually had to do with our horses, my family's horses passed in my 20s, my early 20s. And I think part of not talking about it was like just grief.
Mm.
And so I lost connection with that herd after they passed. And so I do think that's part of why I didn't talk about it. But I'm only kind of now realizing how much I learned from growing up with a herd. Not just horses, but a herd, and they're very different things. And how much, like, now I'm kind of re-entering the world of horses. And of course, where I live now, all the horses, they tend to live in stalls. And it's just a
Mm.
completely different experience of being a horse. And it's a very different experience of being a human relating to a horse. When you're relating to horses that have a more individualized life than horses that have a 30 horse life. It's a very different experience. And I'm just beginning to piece through what that is and how to articulate it, because so much of it's actually not verbal because they're animals, they're horses. So it's not like we do talk about it, just not with words. Um,
Yes.
yeah, so there's and you could say that's on the edge of society, but it's certainly on the edge of what we know to talk about, right? It's certainly on the edge of what we think of as worth bringing into our identity and worth paying attention to as adults. Since I've started talking, I found all these people in my life who also had these profound, often horses, that's what they tend to tell me about, but other animal relationships or forests or oceans. And like, oh yeah, that's where I learned how X, Y, and Z. And they usually don't have a great words for it. They're trying to formulate the words because we haven't given the attention to articulating some of the most important experiences, mystical, more than human experiences that just shape our souls. And yet, like, those are not the things we're writing essays about in school. or anywhere else for that matter.
Yeah. Well, I think you should write an essay about the
Yeah, you're not the first person who said that. It's so hard to get the words for it. But yes, I'm working on
yeah.
it.
But I think you put your finger on something there, and it's good that we name it as well, because there is a risk when in order to in order to broaden our picture of reality, we bring in stories from other times and places, other people's stories, and that can conjure up a longing that hardens into a false sense of loss and emptiness, where actually the things that we're longing for, the things we're looking for, are there closer to home, but undervalued, not named, trivialized by the ways in which they are described and located on the maps of the dominant culture, but nonetheless, present within the field of experience. And
Mm,
I'm struck by what you say about coming back to those childhood experiences now, because I can recognize that as well, not least in the experiences that I had growing up around church, which had some similarities, I think, probably to your Quaker context, not least in the richness of the space of possibility and agency that was afforded to me as a child in that part of my life by comparison to in the school setting. And I know that that won't be the experience of everybody who grew up around churches, but it certainly was mine in ways that were formative, in ways that I sort of see more clearly and come to appreciate more deeply here in the, you know, what might be the middle years of life. Um, and I'm struck too that you spoke about gift and
mm,
gifts and about the ordinariness of gifts in that setting, which hints at the possibility that we can have communities in which gifts are abundant rather than scarce.
mm,
And I've been thinking about this a lot because, in relation to those questions around big systems that sort of Anna threw into the beginning of our conversation, and not least our systems of education and how the kinds of, small scale undertakings that you and I are part of relate to the dominant forms, the institutional forms of education that we've inherited from the recent past. I've been thinking about Max Weber's three forms of authority. And for Weber, um, authority is not just power. Authority is power that doesn't need to rely on coercion, power that is experienced as legitimate. And he says, well, he describes sort of three types of source for that kind of power. And the first is the kind that has been dominant in modern societies, which in Weber's terms is legal, rational power or bureaucratic power. It's impersonal, it's rule-based, it's formal and structured. It contrasts with traditional power, which is much more located uh, historically and in lineage rather than in rational construction of rules and systems. And then there's a third kind of power, which he doesn't exactly locate as the sort of most primitive form, although sometimes that's where it's put in mapping of this. It's charismatic power. And Weber basically revived the word charisma that anyone speaks about charisma today is due to the influence of Weber and this description of the three forms of power. But charisma was an important word in the early church, and it's there, particularly in Paul's writings in the New Testament. And it was a word that Paul sort of invented as a twist on an existing Greek word and an existing Hebrew concept. But charisma is the gifts of grace. And to go back to Weber for a moment, so for Weber, charismatic power is power that's located in the special influence of a person who people will willingly obey, will willingly follow, will willingly experience as legitimate their power, not because of a kind of multi-generational tradition, not because of a legal framework, but because of something that this person seems to have. And it seems to me that in Weber's version, what's less clear because he's constructing it in modernity is the sense that that isn't a property of that person, but it's a property of something that stands behind that person that happens to be coming through that person just now. And the reason I'm thinking about this is because I think that our educational systems and institutions are inherited from the age of legal, rational, bureaucratic power. But as I said earlier, the life and the energy seems to be dying in them because in some sense, the spirit of the times has moved on. And the spirit of the times lies with something more like charismatic power. The projects, the people that seem to have cultural energy today are more of that kind. But I think that if we're stuck with this modern sense of charisma as being a scarce thing that belongs to certain individuals and is intrinsic to that individual, then that would be very dangerous. So I think we need to recover a sense of a multiplicity of and an abundance of grace and gifts that, probably for lots of people is not going to be located within uh, a historical theological framework of the kind that the word charisma originated from. It's a concept that was displaced pretty early within the history of the institutionalization of Christianity anyway. But in some way, if the kind of times we're in are times where the undertakings, the initiatives, the projects that have energy in them are going to be more characterized by charismatic authority than by bureaucratic authority, that doesn't need to be a bad thing, but it requires that we attend to the dark forms of charisma. And I think it requires that we attend to the possibility of, of experiencing gifts that come through us, but don't in any way belong to us. And that actually, if we make the mistake of thinking that we should take pride in our individual manifestation of these gifts, then that's going to dam up the spring through which they are coming in any healthy way. How about that, Sarah? You went to
Oh,
theological college.
oh, I love it. I love it. And it's yeah, I mean in the Quaker tradition, the understanding, and this is I think in many places, this is not particularly Quaker. Um, the gift, the divine gift is not for you.
Mm-hmm.
The divine gift is for the community. We can define community in lots of different ways, and certainly it's we might, the body of God, the community of the church. It's coming, what's coming through you. But I think I was also quite amused. I was thinking about the sort of charisma, we come to think of it as kind of related to the word charm, which has a completely different
Yes.
history, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it's French. It's not coming from the Greek, and so, but often we think of charisma as like, I was just kind of checking. So the Merriam-Webster, the English, like here in America, the personal magic of leadership arousing special loyalty or enthusiasm.
Right.
His success was from his charisma. So it's kind of reference to to almost like this magical thing. And it's a place where I like, I mean, I think that the relationship between divine gift and magic is like a rich, fertile ground place for exploration. Other people would say that one should sternly separate the two. Um,
Yes.
but regardless of that, it's like, but there's no sh either way, like whether you're thinking of it as like a form of an incantation or as a like the power of the speaking is such that others are drawn to you, right? That's part of
Mm.
what some forms of incantation can do. So the charisma is speaking out, and people, there's a phenomenal series, BBC series, looking at the new guru, I think is what it's called. It's really great, and it's looking at online, gurus in the online world, and in Instagram and other social media platforms, and recognizing that so much of their power is coming because people are not trusting the prevailing institutional forms.
Yeah.
And so they're going to these online spaces, and they're kind of doing this very, very human thing of they're drawn to that which has a lot of charisma attached to it. And as you
Mhm.
and I, as we both know, with that comes profound danger. Um,
Yes.
because that charisma, as you know, in the Quaker community, where I'm as again, and this continues to inform the communities that I'm cultivating. Like this teaching for
Yeah.
me is like one of the most important, is that like the gift is for the community. It's not about you. If people like you, it's like one of my first lessons I received from my elders was like, if you give powerful, charismatic ministry and someone, they kind of people crush on you. If they
Yeah.
really like what you're saying, they don't like it's not you that they like. They are attending to what's coming through you. And you cannot confuse whatever that
Mm.
initial admiration that they might like feel towards you with you, because otherwise your ego is misplaced and you're
Yeah.
actually, it doesn't have to do with you. It has to
It,
do with what's coming through you.
it's so costly as well.
Oh,
The I remember like very early in my journey of finding a voice
mm,
and stepping into the kind of public roles that I've had in the times that we've known each other. I remember I can think of a single occasion on which I let myself enjoy
mm,
a small group of people projecting onto me.
mm,
And I can think of the damage that just what seemed like a relatively brief moment as a young man, you know, enjoying a new kind of attention that I'd not had before. The way in which I became tangled up with, or the way in which some of the people who were there became tangled up with me, and the cost that that had for me in over a year or so that followed. And I was lucky because it was on a very small scale. It's not a story that anybody particularly knows about or that needs uh, telling in any detail, but it was enough to tell me, like, as soon as you feel that projection coming at you, just step
mm,
to the side. It's like Aikido. Let it pass. Let it go on to something bigger than you. And the other thing that really helped me with that was Martin Shaw, the
mm,
storyteller,
mm,
good friend, long before his kind of dramatic return to Christianity. I remember reading in one of his books a passage, it was in Scatterlings, where he talked about the role of prayer in the kind of charismatic and evangelical churches that he grew up around, which were a bit different to the kind of church where my dad was a minister. And he said, yeah, so, you'll have these prophetic preachers who roll around, the kind of people where the energy that's coming through them is not something that would be helpful to have every Sunday morning. So they move around and they show up a couple of times a year to a particular church, and something big happens when they're there. And part of what prayer is doing in the moment where somebody has allowed something big to come through them into that room is to keep everyone, including the person it came through and everyone else in that room, oriented to the sense that it came from somewhere beyond them and not from them. And I read that a few days after I'd seen Martin telling a story at a Dark Mountain event, which was that was I've seen Martin in front of a lot of audiences, but that was one of the most powerful, probably the most powerful telling that I've seen him give. And at the end of it, as he often does, he did this little ritual where he said, so, in front of you, there are three golden apples hanging in the air. And, one of them is for the story, to feed the story. One of them is for you. The other one is to throw over your shoulder because the ancestors, if we've done any good here, then the ancestors are leaning in. So this apple is to feed them so that they do not eat our lives. And he
Mm,
gets everyone taking part in that little ritual at the end of the telling. I'm like, okay. That, among other things, is a way without relying on us having any shared metaphysical framework, any shared religious tradition, nonetheless, to do the same thing that he's describing a certain kind of prayer doing in the kind of church that he grew up around, to make sure that after something big has happened in a room, the energy is going beyond the
mm,
person who might look like they were the one it was coming from. And that, oh, yeah, that's something that I've carried with me for a long time now.
mm, mm. I love that story. And it's so important.
Hmm.
It's so important, like to feed where it's coming from. It needs to be fed, it needs to be acknowledged so that it doesn't eat your life, right? Like that, because that is possible, like that image it. And I've seen it's like, I mean, it's similar to if you do not understand what that which is, if you do not feed that which is within you, it will destroy you. If you do not act on it, it will hurt you. And as adults, I think that's a really particularly important one. But like, I think part of this question of like, as adult people on a, because adult education is so different, right? Like we're in the midst of it.
Hmm.
And so to be ongoing unlearning and relearning, I think some of the key piece is to be finding the place where what does it mean to give back to that which has given to us and to feed the right,
Hmm.
quote unquote right ancestors, which by which I mean, are you feeding are you giving credit to the institution? Are you giving credit to that which has fed you in ways that might also be harming you? And what is the obligation of what are the energies that you are feeding? And sometimes you need to and should feed the institution. Like sometimes that's entirely appropriate depending on the situation. Are you feeding like your ancestors? Are you feeding the divine? And are you ensuring that that which you are feeding, that you're feeding it in such a way so that it doesn't like consume you, who are opening yourself to give voice? And
Yes.
I see this like some of what it can easily happen that like the powers that can come into a person to speak truth to power. To do that, you open yourself to all sorts of things.
Yes.
And so like in what part of what the Quakers figured out is to have elders. And like, like Quakers are very imperfect people. Like I don't want to make it sound like
Mhm.
this community does not have its own, work to do, or that they're actively doing some really important work in their own decolonization journey. Do not want to put anyone on a pedestal here, but to recognize that there are a few things that have been learned. And one of them is like the minute the person with that charisma, also there's also almost always accompanied with an elder. There is a sense of like we use the word accountability in a weird way today. And the eldering that I'm talking about is not, there is an accountability, but the accountability is less to your stated deliverable outcomes, which has
Mhm.
its own value. I don't want to completely dismiss that. But is more to that which is coming. It's like, are you being faithful to what you have been called to do? And to recognize
Mm.
that as a question that no individual can fully answer by themselves.
Yes. And that thing of, so I completely agree that you need elders and you need peers.
Mm,
And those are different kinds of relationship. um, partly just because of the kind of time that you spend with each of those. At one level, you could describe it just in terms of the amount of time that you tend to get more time together with your peers than you get with your elders, because part of the nature of those who are in the role of elders is that they're likely to have many people who they're supporting. But actually, I say the kind of time because it's not just about quantity, it's actually about the need for different kinds of relationship and different kinds of association and support. But you need those things. And to take this to the concrete experience that I've had of me and Anna, we're talking about a different Anna now to Anna Smirby, who asked the question at the beginning, another Swedish Anna, Anna Björkman, my other half. The journey that we have been on over, well, really over the last 13 years since we met, but certainly over the last 6 years since we took a school called Home out into the world for the first time. It's one of the things that accountability means to me, especially with this read on the times we're in, of saying, well, yeah, I think that we are living in times where the cultural energy has moved on from the legal, rational, and bureaucratic into this field of the charismatic, is how do you keep yourselves accountable to not falling into the toxic patterns that are very well described to us of what charisma and charismatic energy and association feels like. Bureaucratic authority can tell you a very good story about what charismatic authority looks like. And the simplest version of the story is, oh, that's turning into a cult.
Like that, there's a reason why the bureaucracy arose from out of charismatic people, right? Like there's a reason why the church established a bureaucracy and not just relied upon why abbeys created bureaucracies and not just the charisma of individual abbots or individual, brothers. Like it was like they were conscious, and I think in so many, like so much in that system, for all of its, it had many challenges, but like that the formation of the system of abbeys, which is part of what leads to higher education and university structure and higher education today, like is like they needed to create a form of artificial intelligence, if you would, that could exist, separate from the individual power.
Yeah, I mean, apart from anything else, stabilizing anything within a world like this
Mm.
requires some kind of ongoing, dynamic between, what gives life and what sustains life and what allows for good endings. There's a reason why these trinities show up all over the place, whether it's, you know, um, in Hinduism, where you have the sort of the three gods of sort of beginning and sustaining and ending, Shiva as a god of ending, or whether it's the Norns in Norse mythology or whatever. And maybe really all we're doing here is locating Weber's rather abstract trinity of the three forms of authority in an exercise in comparative religion, and allowing it therefore to release some of the things that are hidden within it. I hadn't had that thought until this moment in this conversation. But what's helpful to me is one of my elders is Alistair McIntosh, who I know you also know Alistair's work, and Alistair is also, among other things, a Quaker. And Alistair sent me 20 years ago this year a draft of a book, which was eventually published as a book that he and Matt Carmichael co-wrote, published years later as the Spiritual Activism Handbook. And it had sort of started out as something that was materials for his master's students at the Center for Human Ecology. And I don't know whether this was in the original draft or whether I projected it onto it. Either are possible. But My recollection is that part of the impetus between some of what's in that book came from the experience of the moment in the 90s when Edinburgh University shut down the Centre for Human Ecology. And Alistair's students said, well, that's interesting. Okay, we're no longer part of the university, but we're going to carry on. We're going to carry on being the Centre for Human Ecology. And that, the fingers are then pointed. Oh, you see, that's the cult of Alistair McIntosh. And Alistair, being the man of great integrity that he is, part of his response is to go and look at what we know about cult dynamics and look into the research and ask, if we are going to play with fire, if we are going to work with spirit and with charismatic authority in a time where the formal frameworks don't even recognize that that stuff is real, except that it's probably dangerous, then how do we hold ourselves and each other to account and avoid falling into those traps? And so there's a whole chapter in the Spiritual Activism Handbook, which is all about what both tells some of the stories of how bad it can be and shows some of the fruits of the research into what are the patterns of cult dynamics and how do we avoid this. And so within the work of our school, one of the things that emerged as a how do we hold ourselves accountable to this was just a moment of recognition of saying, we seem to be a school of people who have more than one school. When I look around at the people who are part of the Long Table, which is our ongoing community, and the general weave of friends and collaborators and associates around a school called home, one of the things they have in common is that they generally have other deep commitments. Often they have been responsible. I think of like Caroline Ross, for example, an artist, great friend of ours, has run her own Tai Chi school for 20 years and brings the fruits of the things learned within that tradition into our conversations around our school. But most of the people around the table at one of our gatherings would have their version of that in smaller or larger ways. And there is nothing within the way in which we convene people which seeks to create a scarcity or a monopoly of belonging. And that to me, one of the touchstones for going, we need to make sure that we are not developing any kind of cult of Dougald Nana or anything like that. And just that marker of going, this is a place where part of what we value is what people bring because they're also deeply involved in other things, and we'd be the poorer without that. That's one of the ways, just at a practical level, of steering towards a space in which we might be able to bring our gifts in helpful ways rather than get stuck in toxic patterns.
That's really exquisite. And to name, so many pieces there, to name, to recognize, yeah, there is a power becoming a cult. Even just to reckon, and not to try to say, oh no, I'm not a cult, but to say, okay, that's a possibility of this fire. This fire can't go in that direction. So what are the constraints and limitations that we are imposing upon ourselves, that we are relishing in order to support ourselves? The bureaucracy creates one form of constraint. So we also need constraint. We also need our limitations and to recognize them. And for all of you listening who are wanting to create, who are either creating schools, wanting to create schools, what is that? What is the container around which you are working and around which the people you are gathering are being held that will help you not to go down some of the pathways that are very, very possible? And I think that, not a monopoly of belonging is a really, really beautiful. I love that framing. And that there's something about you have both the small and the scale. You kind of balance between the smallness of the kitchen table. And I think this podcast, the very first interview I did for this podcast conversation, was at my kitchen table in the Bronx with Alistair McIntosh. So
oh, wonderful. Oh, I must listen to that.
and recording was so awful, and I I was so, I just, it was, I don't even think I have it up. I'm not even sure that I have it up. I might, but
Oh,
it's like, it's buried and like, it was just very poor quality. And I've been meaning to go back and circle back with them, but,
hmm,
and it's very much, it is a space is like, so one of the things that I learned in doing ritual, doing more rituals for folks at different life stages is particularly having just done these ones and these two I recently did around, coming into the world babies. Um, that particular threshold was like, both of them, they both, one family did a Catholic baptism and the other family did a Jewish, um, Brett, Brett. And so for both of them, they had, in this case, the, I don't know, almost stereotypical priest dash rabbi, like doing the ceremony that has been done for thousands of years, right? And both
hmm,
these traditions, which are actually have fascinatingly similar in ways that like I hadn't
hmm,
quite put together till I saw them back to back. And then we did a very, very different ceremony that also has thousands of years of animist traditions behind it, but which we are also revitalizing. And and creating anew, and that they
hmm,
were able to go back to back. But it was so important, it's always been so important to me, as you say, to, this is not about either or. This is not
hmm,
about the animist or the Christian or the other global religion. This is not, nor is it about trying to become something that we are not.
yeah,
And it is about enabling not multiple belongings, but just the fullness of the self and the
hmm,
recognition that no one of these things needs to have everything. And that together we can create like new forms of, not new, ancient new, right?
hmm,
Forms of being together. And like just, and the more I understand the histories of global traditions, the more I think that that is the intertwining of the folk and the global tradition is actually very deep. And that's part of both the religious expression, lifelong religious expressions, because lifelong religious education is kind of what lifelong learning is. Like, it's that
hmm,
recognition that as you go through your life, you go through the rituals, you go through the processes, and at each stage of life, there's a new kind of education of both teaching and learning that you're in, and that you're a
hmm,
part of, and that you're partaking in. And that's part of, I think, what we're relearning today, um, are those different modes, so those different moments in life, and what we're unlearning. And today we have to do a huge amount of unlearning. I don't know, maybe that's always been true. I can't say for sure, but I know it's
hmm,
true in our world today. And yeah, and so like understanding the being willing to submit ourselves. And I think it does. And I think you told me, I don't know this for sure. I think you told me that Alistair also has a like kind of an accountability circle of some kind. Did you tell me that?
I'm sure that's true.
Yeah.
Um, do you know what? I think the story I may have told you, Sarah, is a funnier one than that, which involves Elizabeth Oldfield,
Mm.
who you may know, who's the host of the Sacred podcast, who has a wonderful book called Fully Alive that's coming out in a few weeks' time. And I had a message from Liz a couple of years ago, and she'd been hosting a conversation on stage with Alistair at a festival organized by the Perspectiva folks in the UK. And the first question from the floor had come from someone who Alistair must have been talking about technology as part of his talk. And the first question from the floor was somebody asking if you were invited to join Google's ethics board, Alistair, would you agree to do so? And Alistair's quite deaf, and he misheard, and he said, "Dougald, Dougald Hine. Oh yes, I like Dougald. I'd join his ethics board." And when I heard this story, I wrote to Alistair and I said, "Alistair, I'm starting an ethics board just because you've offered to join it."
Oh, it's amazing. Oh,
And this said, like a third of the audience roared with laughter, and the other two-thirds had never heard of me and didn't have a clue what was going on. Oh.
oh, and so so do you now have an ethics board?
Well, it consists of there being certain people who I go and sit up late and drink whiskey with and talk about what what matters most and whose questions and challenges I take very seriously. And Alistair is among them. I wouldn't say it's more formalized than that.
Well, I have to say, I think that's a very old tradition of eldering within the European context. So you're very much in an ancestral tradition there. Um, and so I'm very curious if you could like if there's something that's as you've been teaching
Mm,
and as you've been running online courses and both come out of the in-person, like I think that like as we're talking, it's very clear, you weave the online and the virtual and the in-person spaces and the interactions. I think they kind of authentically interweave in your work and life in many different ways. Um, and what are the big ethical I wonder if you can share one or two ethical dilemmas or questions that arise for you as someone who's holding the container of a school called home. And obviously,
mm,
you're not doing this alone. You're doing this with Anna and
yes.
and a community of people, right? It's not just you.
Yeah. So I think that one of the questions that I sit with
Mm,
is how to find right ways of being with work and money in relation to these kinds of things.
mm,
Um, I'm sitting here in what is a pretty large house with a large garden and a big red wooden barn at the bottom of the garden that is the base for our school. It's also our family home. It's possible due to a combination of Anna having a day job working for a local municipality that's pretty well paid, and me being able at this stage in my life to get paid quite decently for this combination of writing and speaking and teaching that I do. And I'm very grateful for all of that. And I know that there are people I think of as peers who are in far, far more precarious situations.
mhm, mhm,
And, I feel like we're still on a journey as a school, learning how to be with the role of abundance and the role of gift and um, the human challenges of trying to live for a world that is largely illegible to the systems that
mm,
dominate the world just now, whilst benefiting from those systems in ways that allow me to be sitting here in this big house with the big garden and the rest of it. And, you know, part of that is how do we create the conditions for generosity, the conditions for relationships that allow the attention and the love that flows around the work that we're doing as a school to create conditions of possibility for others who we're in relationship with. Another part of it is, all of the work that I do has been for a long, long time deeply entwined with the unfolding realities of the climate crisis and the rest of the trouble that the world is in.
mm,
And the reason why I put it like that is because it's very easy for the climate crisis to be presented as something so large and overwhelming that everything else needs to get out of the way because we just need to fix this yesterday. And I fully understand where the urgency and the sense of panic comes from around that. And this was part of what I was writing about in At Work in the Ruins, my most recent book.
mm,
I have become increasingly troubled over the years by what can happen as a consequence of that way of framing things.
Mm.
And for a long time, the reason why I centered the climate crisis within my ways of speaking about the trouble the world is in is because it's the place where the people who are most sheltered from the shadow side of modernity get the wake up call to a sense of living in a time of endings. There's a great book called A World of Many Worlds, edited by Mario Blazer and Marisol de la Cadena. And they say in the introduction to that, this conversation about the Anthropocene that starts from places like Berlin or Stockholm or London or San Francisco sounds from elsewhere like the world of the powerful discovering that its world too could end after having brought ending to so many other worlds.
Yep.
And they open up this sense that that can go in different directions. On the one hand, that can be a necessary humbling where finally the citizens of the world of the powerful have their ears opened to things that people have been trying to tell them for so long about
Mm.
the way people like them have been showing up, people like me have been showing up in the world. And on the other hand, very, very easily, and I feel like the center of gravity has moved in this direction over the last 5 or 10 years, that sense of an ending among the world of the powerful can become a new legitimating force for old colonial patterns of domination and of attempting to manage and fix and control the world from places that happen to be the same places that have been centers of imperial power for generations or centuries. And now it's being done in the name of saving the world, and that reinvigorates what was an exhausted project of modernity slash coloniality. And so all of that is also the context to the work that I've been doing over the years. And that brings with it a sense of another kind of precarity, a precarity of the systems that, who knows quite how the ruptures and fragmentations and, you know, endings, because there is no end. There's not a kind of day when you wake up and on the front page of the newspaper it says the world as we know it has ended. That's not how these things play out. But there will be, dramatic moments of rupture, of breakdown, partial cobbling together, recoveries, and hopefully, because it's what I try to contribute to, also reconstructions, reimaginings, regrowing a living culture below the radar, at the edges, or just in the places that are being overlooked and undervalued within the places that think of themselves as the centers. And things grow out of that. But, again, bringing it back to me sitting here talking to you over Zoom, convening courses that happen over Zoom where people are sending payments through Stripe or PayPal or whatever to take part, or sometimes exchanging work and gifts and offerings instead of money. All of that, I'm very aware that these systems are fragile and we are to a significant degree dependent on them. And at a certain point, I have to step back into that position that I spoke about when you brought that first question from Anna about how do we respond to the vastness of this and who do we trust and so on. That there's a well, there's an image that a climber friend gave me years and years ago. And he said, when you're climbing a rock face, very often you can't see a hold above you until it comes into reach.
Mm.
You can't look all the way up the rock face and see all of the holds. It might look unclimbable. Your attention needs to be to the next hold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in some way, that's also how we have to place ourselves in relation to the vastness of the trouble around and ahead of us.
Mm. I really appreciate the honesty, on these two different or 2 to 3 different strands of things you're naming here, these kind of ethical dilemmas and challenges. Um, I'm remembering a time this was before I was doing what I'm doing now, when I was very conscious that like I was getting paid because to help people in the system. I was able to be out of the system, helping people in the system because they were in the system.
Yes.
Right. And that's true for a lot of quote unquote healers and alternative things, quote unquote alternative things. Like, you know, we could say this for the whole thing about the nonprofit world exists only because like the for-profit world enables it to exist. Like, and like there's a weird thing there,
Mm.
right? That and there's a weird piece of it. And that um and I do, and so I appreciate kind of helping to name some of that. I think we don't talk about it very often and kind of pretend like that's not happening. It's like, no, 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 that's part of what's happening. And what is what's being taught, right? Is what's being conveyed. What's because you're always teaching the content it's the whole being that's always being taught. It's not just what's being said or what's in a what's in a syllabus is only one tiny piece of what people are learning from each other.
Yeah.
Um, and this thing about like we part of I living with and living alongside um my partner being an Indigenous peacemaker. Yes, sometimes she doesn't do it that often, but every now and then, like she'll kind of hear someone, perhaps myself, saying something along the lines of, the fear of the upcoming apocalypse.
Mm.
And she kind of just rolls her eyes,
Yes.
you know? And I don't go there the way I used to. I used to really go there. I don't go there, and it's in part, it's like, oh, right, like there's already been so many genocides.
Yeah.
Livelihoods have been the Buffalo Nation is almost completely destroyed. Like so many ways of life were have been already lost. And that this modern world displaced another world that was also modern.
Mm.
And it's just like the arrogance of saying that somehow um, we haven't already created apocalypses. And the moments, like there are so many moments when in any given community when you're having yet another apocalyptic horror. And it happens all over the world. So who am I to preach of yet another one? Am I just replicating 2,000 years of looking for the second coming? Like, am I just replicating that? Like that
Mm.
ancestral memory of of our preacher ancestors of that Christian tradition, which seeks that linearity, um, and is always looking for the end of the world. Am I just replicating that? And that part of how people have how and my partner being an accountant by trade, like she chose, like she could have done anything, and I think one of the reasons that she chose that. She's like, yeah, it's always useful. And she didn't quite say in the world that pays, but
Mm.
that's what she was saying, And so now like we've developed a little mini course offering thing for like heart-centered accountability, we're calling it. But it's like because so many people like we also need to learn no, we also do people do need help, do need support living in the world that is quite easily set out to hurt them as
Yes.
well as to create something different. And so many of the people who are doing heart-centered work don't get enough money and they don't, they don't pay their bills. And they are teaching courses or offering coaching services and not quite making it themselves. And there's all many, many reasons why that's true. It's different for different people. But so I hear you on that. And it's like, yeah, what are the many ways in which the offerings they were offering are both entangled in the system? I can also help um, people be with it.
Mm. I was thinking of my friend Chris Erskine, who, I don't know if he ever quite put it this way, but this is the way I heard it, and I've gone around passing this on. It's a question along these lines. Show me your incompleteness and contradiction, because I know it's there. And if you can't show me that, what else are you feeling that you have to hide?
Hmm.
And then I think of Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, or Vanessa Andreotti, as many of us know her, depending on which of her texts we've read or what circumstances we've met under. But Vanessa from the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, author of Hospicing Modernity. And there's a passage in Hospicing Modernity where she distinguishes between two different ways of reacting when we hit that realization of the depth of the trouble. One of them is what she calls divestment, and the other one, disinvestment. Divestment is when we try and, extricate ourselves from entanglement with the trouble and the system and complicity and all of the rest of it, and, try and get out to somewhere beyond the reach of it. And
Hmm.
she's like, to the extent that we get close, that's basically a demonstration of our privilege. And she's like, and then there's disinvestment, which is when you stay in place, like you don't rush to go anywhere or to change anything that you're doing, but you start by letting yourself experience how things change when you no longer pretend to yourself that you believe in the promises of modernity, the promises of the dominant system. And then, you learn to show up differently. You practice sobriety, you practice different kinds of attention. And out of that, you catch sight of things that are worth doing starting from here, some of which might involve staying in the context you're in, and some of which might involve moving context. But none of it comes from that kind of understandable but impossible desire to extricate yourself, to not be implicated, to not be part of it. And I feel this even in relation to ancestors,
Hmm.
actually. I feel like one of the challenges, going back to the conversation we had a few years ago of, when your ancestors are the problem, is there's a risk that there are people, for good reasons, with good intentions, trying to divest themselves of their ancestors
Mhm.
and sort of trying to borrow other people's ancestors to make up the gap. And going,
Mhm.
oh yeah, no, I really hate my ancestors. I really hate my ancestors. I'm not like that. And you and me and anyone listening to this probably can see where that comes from. And it's too cheap. You
Mm.
know, it's there's an extraordinary book that I finished recently by a theologian, Christian theologian called Andrew Shanks. And the book is called Hegel versus Interfaith Relations, a general theory of true xenophilia. And I
Oh,
thought, wow,
wow.
you either have to have the best sense of humor or no sense of humor to give a book that title in the early 21st century. I think he's got a great sense of humor. But that thing of like true xenophilia, or maybe costly xenophilia, in the sense that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, another of the great 20th century theologians, spoke about cheap grace or costly grace. And he
Mhm.
said the German church is offering people cheap grace. I think, when Andrew Shanks talks about true xenophilia, that's costly xenophilia. It's not the cheap xenophilia of, hating on your own ancestors in the hope that you'll be accepted as an ally.
Mm.
Uh, that actually staying with the trouble of our own ancestors, and not just the distant ones who we can kind of tell whatever story we want about because there's not that much evidence, but the ones who are recent enough that they really do represent trouble. That for me is part of why I'm, you know, engaged in with my Christian heritage and what I grew up around in a way that is more demanding for me now in my 40s than it has been for most of my adult life, let's say. Because I think that the challenge that lies before us is, can we have true xenophilia and true oikophilia? You know, can we love the stranger and our home? Because
Mm.
at the moment, the world is getting carved up between, you know, cheap xenophilia that's accompanied with a kind of self-loathing that doesn't help anyone, and a cheap oikophilia that's more often than not underwritten by xenophobia. And the really kind of gnarly challenge, as I see it now, and having a school called home, you can't avoid these kinds of questions, is what does it look like to show up with, and I'm not saying that I can do this or that I know what it looks like, but just as a question, true xenophilia and true oikophilia, what does that look like in a world as troubled, as burdened with unfinished histories and ongoing injustices and genocides and the rest of it, as the world that we're having this conversation in?
So I think a title may perhaps for a future
Right.
conversation between us, Dougald, might be um, something along the lines of working with the story of the promised land, of homecoming in the promised land in the midst of unfinished histories.
Mm,
Because so much of these questions of home and of you said that thing, what is to release the promises of modernity.
mm,
And so much of that promise is connected to the hope of the homecoming in the promised land.
mm,
America was the promised land, became, the projected promised land. And what
mm,
does that mean for how we're imagining different kinds of realities and futures? And it continues to reverberate and and scatter dreams and often take people away from wherever they are. As like, can you have a home? How can we have a home together? And maybe maybe none of us belong. And all of us are guests in different ways. Uh,
mm,
it's not, because there's so many ways in which belonging, there are different types of belonging and different types of claims and different types of needs. Um, yeah. So as you're kind of describing that, but yeah, and it kind as and I just love, yeah, and that kind of makes me think about this, how you're calling your own place a school called home,
mm,
and how much of this um of our learning can we possibly find slightly better ways of being together. As my partner says, the world that we live in was not a world that was made for her. And
mm,
as I've come to see more and more of what she means, that doesn't mean she can't find ways of engaging with it.
mm,
Um, but it's like our world has not always been made for us, and yet we are actively part of creating what's arising.
mm.
So
Yes.
thank you for all the to the collective work of we weaving us into um to think about the future is to start embedded in these generations, as we sort of started this conversation with.
Mm.
And thank you to all of the students and colleagues and elders who have been patient enough with us in our learning.
Amen.
uh, and in our mutterings.
Oh, yes. Well, it's a great pleasure to sit around this digital campfire with you for uh, an hour or two and just share some stories and some wonderings and some griefs and some laughter. Um, and I should probably head out into the
Yeah.
garden and do a bit of watering now.
Yeah, it's 'tis the season to be out there often.
It
Um,
is indeed.
well, thank you so much, and I look forward to talking with you soon. Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and reenchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.